The Stanley Cup was handed out in late September inside an empty arena in Edmonton to a team from Tampa Bay after 2 straight months of quarantine. That sentence still feels wrong. The 2020 playoffs happened in a version of hockey nobody had ever seen before, with no packed buildings, no travel, no real home games, no fans waiting outside, and no bars full after overtime. It was just 2 locked-down Canadian cities, a stack of rules, players living in hotels, and a league trying to finish a season while the world was shut down. Most people remember the bubble in broad strokes. The season stopped because of COVID. The NHL came back in August, Toronto had the East, Edmonton had the West, and Tampa won the Cup. That version is neat, but the real one was stranger and a lot more exhausting than people remember. The regular season stopped on March 12th. The next day, the pause became official, and from there, the whole league shifted into planning mode. The NHL and NHLPA spent weeks trying to figure out if the year could be saved at all, because there was no path to a normal restart. There would be no full schedule, no travel, no normal crowds, and no real playoff race. In the end, the league declared the regular season complete through games played on March 11th, which meant 189 scheduled games were gone. From there, the NHL built something that looked more like a tournament than the Stanley Cup playoffs people were used to. 24 teams got in. The top 4 teams in each conference were safe and played a round robin to sort out seeding, while the next 8 teams in each conference played best-of-5 qualifying series just to reach the first round. So the postseason opened with some teams trying to get into the playoffs, while others were already in and only playing for position. The bracket looked familiar, only from far away. That setup created one of the oddest side effects of the whole season, because a placeholder team from the qualifying round was allowed to win the draft lottery. The Rangers lost to Carolina in the play-in round, then won the second phase of the lottery and took Alexis Lafreniere first overall. For a few weeks, the NHL had a system where a team could take part in the return tournament and still walk away with the number 1 pick. Then there were the hub cities. Toronto got the East and Edmonton got the West, at least at first. The early rounds were split between the 2 cities, but then the whole thing narrowed. And by the time the conference finals and the Stanley Cup final arrived, everybody was in Edmonton. So the cup ended up being awarded in Alberta to a team from Florida after months of shutdown and isolation. Players started arriving in late July. Games started on August 1st. And once everybody got inside the bubble, daily life shrank fast. The league put hard limits on who could be there. Each team could bring only a capped group of players and staff, and clubs were assigned to specific hotels. In Toronto, teams were mainly at Hotel X and the Fairmont Royal York, while in Edmonton, they were based at the JW Marriott and Sutton Place. Those hotels became part of the secure zone, which meant one rule controlled almost everything else: stay inside. If somebody left the secure zone without approval, he risked extra testing, quarantine, loss of access, and possible removal from team activity. The return-to-play documents were dry and blunt, with masks required in common areas, distancing in dining spaces, no wandering around the city, no casual meetups, and no quick break from the grind after a bad loss. The bubble was supposed to be sealed, and the people inside it were expected to treat it that way every day. That changed the feel of playoff life in a way fans could sense even while watching from home. The routine became repetitive, with players waking up in the same hotel rooms, eating under restrictions, taking the same bus to the same rink, playing in the same empty building, and then going back to the same rooms. The league allowed some flexibility around food and recovery, including room service, hotel catering, delivery, and pools if distancing worked, while saunas and steam rooms stayed closed. None of those details sound huge by itself, but together, they defined the whole experience. The media side changed too, with most of the coverage moving virtual. Reporters inside the bubble had limited access and could not move freely around the hotels or interact with players in the usual ways, which stripped away a lot of the ordinary noise around playoff hockey. There was no crowd around a scrum, no hallway ambush after a loss, and no arena concourse buzz. Everything looked cleaner and flatter, and even the interviews had a different feel, with questions coming through screens and answers coming through masks or distance. A lot of the little moments that normally give a playoff run texture just never happened. The health plan, to the league's credit, worked. By the end of the postseason, the NHL had reported more than 33,000 tests in the Toronto and Edmonton bubbles, with 0 positive tests inside the secure zones. That is the reason the tournament got to the finish line, because the structure was strict, the testing was constant, and the rules held. Still, the thing worked because it was hard on the people inside it. Bettman later admitted there was no realistic way to hold a full regular season under those conditions, because it would not have been fair to the players. By the time the Cup final ended in late September, some teams had been stuck inside the bubble for around 2 months. Reuters described the Lightning finally leaving the bubble with the Stanley Cup after 2 straight months of quarantine, and that word fits. Families eventually entered under their own testing and quarantine rules, though that came later and did not erase the earlier stretch when players were alone with teammates and staff for weeks at a time. That detail matters because the bubble was never only about hockey. It was about isolation, routine, and the strange mental grind of being cut off from normal life while trying to play the biggest games of the year. For some players, that part was sometimes harder than the games themselves. You could feel the weirdness on the ice too. The buildings were empty, crowd noise had to be pumped in, and digital graphics filled the dead space. A goal could still matter, a hit could still wake up a bench, and an overtime winner could still end a season. But the whole thing looked like hockey staged in a quiet room. The sport is built around reaction, from home crowds and road crowds to noise rolling down from the stands and pressure from the glass. Strip all that away, and the tone changes, even if the effort stays real. And the effort was real. That part gets lost because the setting was so strange. The players competed hard, the pace was good, and some of the games were excellent. Columbus and Tampa played a 5-overtime game that lasted more than 6 hours and turned into one of the longest games in league history, with Braden Point finally ending it in the 5th overtime. That happened in an empty rink, in a quarantined city, in August, while 2 teams basically played the length of 2 full games in one night. If you want one image that captures bubble hockey, that is probably the one. The qualifying round pushed the whole thing further off its normal axis. Montreal got in because the field expanded and then knocked out Pittsburgh, while Chicago got in through the same opening and knocked out Edmonton. 2 teams that would not have touched a standard 16-team bracket were suddenly central parts of the playoff story because the league needed a solution and built one fast. Then, the outside world cut back into the bubble. On August 27th and 28th, NHL players chose not to play in support of the push against racial injustice after the police shooting of Jacob Blake in Wisconsin. The schedule stopped, games were postponed, and for a moment, the sealed-off feel of the bubble cracked open. The league had to acknowledge the obvious. A sports bubble can regulate testing, movement, and access, but it cannot separate itself from the rest of the world. By the time the bracket got down to the final, the geography barely made sense anymore. Tampa Bay came out of the East, Dallas came out of the West, and the final was played entirely in Edmonton. One conference had started in Toronto and effectively disappeared from the map. The back half of the postseason felt more like a neutral site tournament than a normal cup run, with a team from Florida and a team from Texas playing for the cup in northern Alberta at the end of September, in front of almost nobody. The final itself gets flattened now into a result, which undersells how odd it really was. Tampa won in 6. Victor Hedman won the Conn Smythe, and Steven Stamkos, who had barely played because of injury, gave Tampa one famous shift and one goal earlier in the series before lifting the cup at the end. Reuters called the celebration eerie, and that is exactly what it looked like. The players still had the cup, the handshakes, and the photos, but they did not have the sound that usually carries those moments. The quiet mattered because it came after months of shutdown, daily testing, hotel isolation, and a whole summer of players staying inside the same few blocks while trying to win the hardest trophy in the sport. When Bettman told Tampa it might have been the hardest cup to win, the line landed because the players had gone through something no other champion had lived through before. The timing made the whole thing feel even more detached from reality. Seattle unveiled the Kraken name during the bubble. The draft lottery happened during the bubble, and free agency was pushed into October. The Cup final started on September 19th and ended on September 28th. Hockey usually gives you weather cues, and you know where you are in the season by the month and the feel of the schedule. The bubble wrecked all of that. Summer became playoff time. Fall arrived before the Cup was awarded, and the sport lost its normal rhythm, but kept going anyway. That probably explains why memory softens it now. People remember the novelty first, the empty seats, the fake crowd noise, the odd TV look, maybe the Columbus-Tampa marathon, maybe Tampa finally winning, and maybe Montreal and Chicago getting into a bracket they normally would not have touched. What fades a little is how tightly controlled and exhausting the bubble was on a daily level. Stay in the zone, test every day, wear the mask, eat under restrictions, and then return to the same hotel, the same bus, and the same rink. That was the life, and it shapes the memory of the whole tournament more than people usually admit. Before we close this one out, subscribe to Beyond the Bench, like the video, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the 2020 Bubble Cup deserves more respect? Or do you still see it as the strangest Stanley Cup run ever? What people forget is not just that the bubble looked unusual. It's that the bubble was a fully locked down playoff world dropped into a season that had already lost its normal shape, with play-in rounds that were not really playoff rounds, a draft lottery that got weirder the longer you looked at it, no fans, no travel, no normal home ice, and a Stanley Cup final between two Southern teams in Edmonton at the end of September. All of that happened, and the league still got to the finish line. That might be the strangest part of the whole thing.